Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver. The remains of Chapter 5. In the last episode, Mirela saved herself from having her blood drained by getting a job working for the vampires. Frank discovered that Konstantin and Alaya are the vampires, while Radu is their living descendant who was raised as their son. With his memory coming back, Frank asks to make a pilgrimage to the Vril Accumulator to see it on behalf of his dead friends. It is the middle of the day, so Radu agrees to take him there. Only a little over an hour later, they were dismounting in the rocky gorge of one of the Alps' tributaries. The path had become too narrow and too twisted for the horses, winding up it, as it did, into the Carpathian mountains. Grey rock leaned in on them from both sides, and the stream's chatter echoed off damp walls greened with stubborn grasses. A shallow landing, big enough to take 2 boats, marked the end of the navigable part of the stream. Their party stopped at the Hythe, where the gap between the cliff sides had been widened by picks to the size of a small room. Frank was both chilled and shaken, his wounds jostled by the ride and woken by activity as they had not been for days. He felt oddly on edge, conscious that his sluggish blood had sped up, tingling under his skin. It didn't make it easier to dismount with one bound-up arm when his horse was sidling and sidestepping under him as if it was being bitten by 1,000 hornets. But he understood its distress, his own instincts telling him that this place was bigger, stranger than it seemed. In the end, one of the men who had accompanied them, the older man he recognised from his rescue, with the coat stitched with 1,000 flowers, had to help him down. Then Vacarescu was by Frank's side. "Cesar, you and Livio see to the horses, and then feed yourselves. We will not be gone more than an hour." Livio, his pock-marked face too young for a beard, looked immediately relieved to be left behind. Cesar, the older man, narrowed his grey-green eyes, his amusement disappearing. He glared at Frank. "My lord, this foreigner is too injured to defend you at need. What your father would say if I let you to walk into danger alone, neither of us will ever know." Vacarescu patted the sword hilt by his side, took a pistol from his saddlebags and thrust it into his sash. "There's no need to fret. No one comes here, and if they do, I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I don't like the thing itself. I don't like the thought of you being alone with it." Frank wondered if the older man too could feel the thing's power from here, like the tickling feet of a swarm of spiders all over his skin. He could feel the world reeling around him as though it was drunk, or he was. A strange, unhinged, concussed sort of feeling. Vacarescu smiled. "It's only a tumble of wires and pots, godfather. Nothing to fear." Cesar shook his head, then unbuckled the bags from his saddle and slid them onto his shoulder, taking the saddle off next and spreading the saddle blanket on the ground. "Sometimes I almost believe you mean that." Vacarescu gave the old man a perplexed look, but seemed to accept that his argument had been won, and his entourage were not insisting on accompanying them. He offered Frank the further path, scarcely wide enough for a single man to walk carefully, placing one foot before the other as if on a tightrope. Frank's throat felt swollen, and his mouth tasted of hot copper, as though he had bitten his tongue. He wished his right hand was out of the sling so he could feel his way along the rock wall, because he wasn't entirely sure he could trust his eyes. "You honestly don't feel this?" "Feel what?" said Vacarescu, coming behind him with his face still as unconcerned as it had been since they left the castle and its sleepers behind. Ahead, the gorge came to a bottleneck, the stream scarcely a foot wide, but ice-clear and so deep he couldn't see any bottom to it. The valley walls on either side drew in until they brushed Frank's shoulders and met just above his head. He had to stoop and thread himself through the narrow, echoing passage, water burbling cold beside him, and the light fading out behind. His skin was so sensitive that he could feel the few little waves of light that passed, as though they were made from powder of diamonds. Around the edges of his vision, in the darkness, he felt shapes crowding. Animals, archetypes, giants and jinn watched him as he approached, and the little hole in the earth through which they now crawled filled up with unimpressed gods. The further end of the tunnel had begun to show as a distant emerald. Frank paused, afraid to go on. I don't know what I really want. I think maybe we should go back. Not you too. A hand pushed him in the small of his back. That touch had been cool in the tower. Here it felt warm. Warm and empty. Absent. Frank realised he could sense the movement of plants in the walls, the strivings of roots and worms, the turmoil of earwigs and woodlice and mites. He could feel spores in the air, life, dormant and drifting. But from Vacarescu he could feel nothing, except that one hand's heat and the sound of his breathing. It was as though Vacarescu didn't really exist at all. Which made it somewhat eerie when he said, "What would your friends think if you turned back now?" Here it doesn't seem impossible to call out for Protheroe's spirit and ask him. I suggest you don't. A sharp tone of voice in the dark, and Frank was shoved forwards, catching himself with one hand on the path. The seething something around him clamoured with ideas for retribution, and he shuddered and forced himself onwards. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad once they were out in the light again. I wouldn't. You're a fine one to talk to me about the need to leave the dead in the ground. At length the tunnel roof began to recede upwards, and the walls to widen out. Frank brushed aside a whispering cloud of white hemlock umbels, and squirmed out into daylight. The wall to his left tumbled down and gave way to greenness. The stream, dammed here by the narrow outlet, spread in a wide green pond, on the left bank of which a darker morass of trees climbed the rocky slopes. On the right the path widened and wound on under an overhang of craggy granite, blotched with green and grey lichens. The sense of unbridled insanity did not go away. If anything, it grew worse. The sunny valley, the trees, the distant bright sky seemed to bulge as a pregnant woman's stomach bulges when the child squirms inside it. Fists were stretching the skin of the world. Frank gave a of protest and staggered sideways. Vacarescu caught him before he tipped himself into the pond. He looped Frank's good arm around his shoulders and snugged one of his own around Frank's waist. That helped. Frank looked down on the side of his companion's jaw with a sense of wonder, for the valley was numinous. All the stones were charged with imminence, the soil was rank with power, and the shadows with sentience. But Radu Vacarescu was nothing more than ordinary, and at this moment Frank could have kissed him for it. How fragile you are. Vacarescu shook his head, his expression caught between contempt and reluctant charm. Frank didn't mind. Fragile seemed to sum it up well enough, and if the judgment came with an arm to hold him up and guide him, it was welcome. We're close now. Lean on me, come on. A few more steps, off a cliff, through an abyss, through fiery lakes, through walls of ice, and the path turned a sharp corner, disappeared into a doorway carved into the side of the hill. "Ah," said Frank again at the sight of it. All possibilities and universes seemed to be streaming from that narrow darkness. He thought he'd be boiled alive if he went in there, the flesh stripped from his bones and seethed in the cauldron with everything that existed. What came out again would not be him. Instinctively he pressed back against his guide. But Vacarescu was looking around as if he saw only a pleasant sunlit glade and an old abandoned cave with a doorway too narrow for bears. He was amused by Frank's panic, but dismissive, pushing Frank on. "It takes some people this way. None quite so bad in my experience, but you'd regret having come so far only to run away." He pried at Frank's fingers, for Frank was clinging tight to the lintel by this point with his one good hand. "Let go!" Radu was right. Beneath the terror, Frank had begun to feel the raising of something shy and curious in him, a part of him that wanted to see, that would never forgive him if he did not. So he didn't struggle too much when Vacarescu peeled his hand from the stone, finger by finger, and shoved him through and in. And after all that, it was only a tumble of pots and wire. A small room filled with stone shelves, and those shelves packed tight with baked earth pots in the shape of closed troughs, rough and reddish with a glaze somewhere between glossy and matte. Thick posts of a metal red as copper poked from each one, and were cobwebbed together with yellower wires, polished brass or even gold. There were no cobwebs, no dust, no leaf scatter blown through the open door. Around the walls, on the ceiling and the tiled floor, words of no language Frank had ever seen before were carved deep, the edges of the cuts as sharp as if they had just been made. All the shelves were arranged around one alcove. All the wires led there, to two more of the red metal posts. These were carved with words all along their length, and terminated in endless knots. It was obvious what they were for. The storm of unreality had quietened a little once they got past the threshold. This room was solid enough for Frank to smell vinegar and lemons and newly spilled blood. He straightened back to his own feet, and Vacarescu let him go. Power, potential, wrongness, a sensation of wary, watching eyes, all this flowed into the new space between them, where once there had been only the sensation of solid human being. "Has anyone ever," Frank indicated the handholds, "ever dared touch them?" Vacarescu laughed, blind to everything. "Anyone who's ever been up here, I should think. It was a test of bravery when I was a child, this and visiting my parents' graves. Neither posed much of a challenge to me." "And no one burned up?" He had taken his host back again. He got a small, genuine look of doubt and wonder as reward, as though Vacarescu had brought him to a place from which time and maturity had long abraded the threat, and Frank had seen the ghost in it. "Nobody ever burned." He looked around, as if seeing it anew, stepped back to consider. "I've stood there 1,000 times, waiting to be given the power to change everything, and nothing happened. I felt nothing. I received nothing. It has never made anything any better. Not for me." He put his hand on one of the golden wires. Frank almost leapt forward, shoved him away. His cry of "No!" had to turn itself into a cough in his mouth, as if nothing at all happened. It should have. His cry of "No!" had to turn itself into a cough in his mouth, as nothing at all happened. It should have. "But I've never had to be pushed into it as though I was struggling through a blizzard," Vacarescu finished. "I don't know what will happen if you do it. Maybe you'll be the first." That was not a reassuring thought. Frank fixed his eyes on the lettering, white against a deep blue background. Mesopotamian? Sumerian? Older than that? It shared some shapes with Akkadian, but it wasn't that. By reading along to the ends of the lines, he managed to sidle sideways toward the grips. Even the words carved on the handles looked like they would bite. Everything that he had sensed on the way into the room, everything that had laid him open and scoured inside his bones, was concentrated there, glittering like ancient stars in a film over the metal. He squared up to them, took down the sling from his shoulder and freed his right hand. Terrified, and terrified, and terrified, like standing above a long drop into water and picturing the fall. And then one moment when he was numb. In that moment he raised his hands and closed them on the bars. It was not like burning at all, but cool, all down to the core of him, cool and slick in his viscera, cool and blue at the back of his mind. The small gods who had seen him arrive paused for a moment in interest and took his measure. Above them he had the sense of larger beings briefly looking away from their eternal concerns to note that something had happened. There was one long breath when all his many voices of self-doubt, all the habits that policed him, fell silent, and he discovered there was something left, under them, still, clear and unassuming as a drop of water on a silver plate. He hadn't expected peace, but that was what came. For a while there was only blue quiet and immensity. But a little later there came hands prizing his fingers away, and then Vacarescu was pulling him out of there, supporting him again, as if he was too wounded to think or move for himself. He allowed it gratefully, full up as though with water. He could feel it seeping out of his pores and wisping away on air that now seemed thin and barren by comparison to the reality he had just touched. Out into the day. The sun had slid past its height and could no longer reach down into the sheer valley, though a band of yellow gold touched the rock wall before them. The lake and the trees were already greyed with shadow. They stopped at the entrance to the passageway out, and Frank became conscious that Vacarescu had taken his hand, was trying to fit it back into the sling. His bowed head was as impervious to magic as ever. It was impossible to know what he was thinking, but worried lines bracketed his mouth. "Don't," Frank said, settling back into himself like a sea anemone closing up when the tide pool grows shallow. He pulled his hand away. Rolling his shoulders, he couldn't quite remember which one had been injured. "It's better now." Vacarescu hissed an indrawn breath through his teeth. He undid the latch that held Frank's coat closed at the throat, undid the first few buttons of his waistcoat, and shoved all the layers aside to look. If he craned his neck, Frank too could see the smooth, undamaged skin beneath unnecessary bandages, where the bullet wound had been unmade. His breath was rough with nerves, but his chest rose and fell painlessly. The broken ribs also healed, as thoroughly as if they had never been touched. "What just happened?" asked Vacarescu, and leaned back against the stone as if he intended to block Frank's return to the outer world, as if he was trying to protect his thief from some uncanny threat. Involuntarily, Frank found himself using the smile he kept for university porters, disappointed lecturers, and older men who thought their money could buy him. The combination of charm and helpless apology had always proved disarming to his opponents in the past. But at that thought he let it fall, ashamed of himself. Vacarescu was not his opponent. He was Frank's rescuer, his host, perhaps even a friend. He deserved honesty. A patch of long grass by the stream's edge looked firm and dry enough to sit on. He sank down there and wound his now painless arms around his knees, gathering himself. There was a lot more of him to take stock of now. Just as it had healed his body, the machine had given him back most of his mind. Only a few of the more frustrating things were still missing. He knew now with some relief that his magic was innate and not the result of paying some terrible price. He was not a witch then, but possibly still a murderer. Frustratingly, that last answer lay still just outside his grasp. I don't know exactly what happened, he began, as Vacarescu detached himself from the rock wall and came to sit down beside him. I felt like I touched... No, this explanation was the wrong way round. He started again. How much do you know about what the device is? Vacarescu leaned in to check Frank's shoulder again, as if reassuring himself that he had not imagined the sudden healing. But Frank didn't think that he needed to let his hand linger so long. Spread fingers curved gently over Frank's collarbone and throat. Nothing. As I say, it's a holy place we associate with St. George. It's said that when he went to kill the dragon, he put on a blue cloak that was stored in this place. The cloak carried the blessing of God and enabled him to do miracles. His hand flexed again on Frank's bared shoulder, and his expression shifted from suspicion to awe. I didn't believe it, but this is too plain for me to ignore. You somehow did the same? You drew on the cloak. It isn't a bad metaphor, Frank agreed, easing himself closer, carefully not allowing himself to think that decency required he demand Radu remove his hand. He was more at ease now with the chaos and rolling potentiality of the glade, but happy to cling to Vacarescu's obdurate normality wherever he could touch it. This sea was far less threatening when he had an anchor. You know of the rising, I suppose? I read of it in the newspapers. It seemed fantastical, but I am not in a position to disbelieve the fantastic. Frank laughed. I'm not explaining this very clearly, am I? I should start from the beginning, which in this story is Atlantis. Ancient records tell that the Atlanteans had access to a type of energy called Vril, which Protheroe defined as the life force of all creation. They built a network of devices across the world to store and transmit the Vril energy, all of it dependent on a master device in Atlantis itself. And that's what this is. Yes, most countries have at least one, typically in mountains, but sometimes in artificial structures instead. There are functionally two in England. Our own is hidden in man-made caves under Glastonbury Tor, but we also fall under the radius of the larger device in New Grange, in the Kingdom of Ireland. Neither of them is as powerful as this one, apparently. This was Protheroe's subject, however, not mine. I was only there to translate. When Atlantis sank, taking the master device with it, they went largely inert. Real magic stopped working. The supernatural receded, miracles grew sparse, and the stage was set for the Enlightenment, in which only the material world could be proved to be true. A blue cloak. Such a telling little detail. St. George had obviously found something here, even in the barren times. Something that Frank recognised. Protheroe thought that the accumulators still held a small field around their local area, and that they continued to charge themselves very slowly, even when the Atlantean source was gone. Not enough to make a worldwide difference, of course, but enough to maintain local supernatural activity, like your Strigoi, perhaps. But then came the rising 12 years ago, when Atlantis returned, and the master location suddenly became available again. Frank laughed. At which point, Protheroe said, things began to get a little weird. I wish he was still around to see how true that was. I wish I'd paid more attention. I was much more interested in the verb forms. If this proves to be one of the rare Atlantean constructed accumulators, it may be our chance to unlock the secrets of hundreds of ancient languages, to learn to read the Egyptian hieroglyphs, to decipher messages from civilizations so ancient we can't imagine their thoughts, voices from 10,000 years ago. He trailed off, smiling, though he felt a little opened up, vulnerable, missing 1 or 2 layers of protective wariness. Protheroe always told me I was missing the point. The point being power, I suppose. Frank waved a hand at the distant door. He could see it still, even though a rock wall was in the way. It's concentrated magical power, a network of it, feeding back to the main storage systems on Atlantis, and flowing in a long wave back out from there, across the world, to every country where their accumulator still survives. That's why, after the Rising, people began to discover their talents. One person might click their fingers to start a fire. Another might have prophetic dreams, or keep flowers from withering, or... He opened his hand to demonstrate how he could summon a little ball of sunlight to his palm. In a soundless explosion, the valley filled with it, white from wall to wall. The water dazzled like diamonds, and Vacarescu's eyes looked pale as hoarfrost, in a face washed out of anything but glare. Oddly, Vacarescu didn't react at all, didn't even squint, just carried on looking at Frank with a measuring, curious look, poised on the cusp of a decision. Somewhat shocked, having expected only his normal globe-like glimmer, Frank let the light go, as if stung, and blinked the after-images from his vision. So his eyes were closed, when Vacarescu's hands closed hard on the nape of his neck and in his hair. He pulled Frank to him bodily and kissed his mouth. It was a very thorough kiss, with no doubt behind it. This was a man, after all, used to giving commands and being immediately obeyed, used to demanding what he wanted and being given it without argument, and Frank for a long while was quite willing to be another unresisting conquest. Only when he started to respond, trying to worm his hands under coat and waistcoat, so that he could pull out the tucked shirt beneath and touch warm skin, did Frank's still healing mind tell him that this was wrong, vile, against the laws of nature. "What are you doing?" Refusing to contemplate what this could mean, he untucked his hands from layers of clothes, pushed Radu away, nowhere near as horrified as he thought he ought to be. That too, that lack of deep-down abhorrence, told him something he didn't want to hear. He pushed the thought away resolutely. He was cursed and probably a murderer. He didn't need to add another flaw to worry about. I am not apologizing. Radu and Frank felt they must certainly be on first-name terms after such an indignity as this, sounded puzzled but unrepentant. You enjoyed it. Frank lifted his head. And so long as your conquests enjoy it, that's all that matters. Isn't it? You're hardly some marriageable maiden whose life I've ruined. Frank thought of the girls who had been offered up for Radu to marry. That too would never have happened in England. Perhaps this sort of behaviour was perfectly all right by the standards of Wallachia. After all, one couldn't expect foreigners to have the same morals expected of one at home. That thought made him almost giddy with relief. My father said I was a curse on anyone who got too close to me, he offered nevertheless, because that was a dread that didn't go away. It was only fair to warn the man off. I bring death and destruction wherever I walk. You are a man whose life I could ruin. I never mean to, but I seem to have made something a habit of it. Just look at my friends. Sighing, Radu stood, offered Frank a hand up. When Frank had risen, he was pulled into a brief, warm hug. Radu's mouth at his ear. Frank. Caro. Frank interrupted, flushed and uneasy at the intimacy. The Honourable Frank Carew, son of the Earl of Hungerford. I remembered. Well then, Frank Carew, mine is a life that I would like to see ruined. There is always the prospect of building something better afterwards, but even if that were not so, I would be pleased to think you bring the fall of my house and the end of my line, so long as you get us all. I don't... said Frank, flustered. I don't want this responsibility. I'll gladly take care of your library, but if you want a saviour, you're looking in the wrong place. You're supposed to be taking care of me. Radu put his head on one side, considering. If I'd known death was so beautiful, I'd have courted him earlier. Frank had to laugh at that, nervously. Oh, now you're just being ridiculous. You don't mean anything of the sort. Radu leaned down and began to work his way into the tunnel that led back to the outer world. His voice sounded wry and patient as Frank followed. I think you'll find that I know myself better than you do at this point. Not all of your memories are back yet, I gather. There was a gap still, everything closing up around it. The central part of the wound where the blade went in first. He still could not remember his crime. Perhaps his mind held back the details because it was as reluctant as he was to relive them again. I think I murdered someone called Gervais. I don't want to remember how or why. I don't want to know myself capable of such evil. To tell you the truth, he said, I dread my memories. What could be so bad that even with everything else healed, I cannot look at this last thing? The ghost of laughter preceded him as they crawled back to normality. I doubt there is anything you could have done, Frank, that would horrify me. We are two wretched specimens of humanity together. Whatever it is, I shall not have any grounds on which to condemn you. That, too, Frank found surprisingly comforting. At the landing where they had left the horses, a fire was now burning. César and Liviu had a black pot of coffee in the ashes, and dark rye bread, cheese and sausage unwrapped on the blankets on which they sat. The horses, hobbled but not tethered, were delicately pulling up clumps of grass from the cliffs, or supping up the water of the stream. The sun was a band of bright gold above head height on the far cliff face. But below, on the ground, it was already growing chill, and evening dews were settling on the rocks. Frank could still feel the accumulator, but at this distance the fidgeting of universes was settled into a dissonant hum. He resonated with it still, but it no longer took up his whole mind, and all the staring eyes that had watched him seemed to have lost interest for now, turned away. It's a horrible thing, said César unexpectedly, handing him a little enamelled cup and a hank of bread. Strange. Frank smiled at him, glad to hear as much. He had imagined from Radu's reaction that he was the only one who could feel it. Awe-inspiring, but ultimately useless. Radu looked up as the darkness widened and widened on the hills. No matter what happened here, still the night falls, and we have to go home. Having spent the day awake, Frank tried to snatch a few hours of sleep before nightfall, but he had scarcely lain down before his door eased slowly open. Silk brushed against the floor outside. All of Frank's thoughts focused suddenly into fear as he scrabbled up to sitting, his back against the iron rungs of his headboard. Elia still smelled of sour earth and too much perfume, and he didn't know how he had managed to miss the implication of that before. How had he ever mistaken her graceful glide into the room, skirts dragging and rustling around her, for something human? Now he knew he could see that unless she spoke, how many ropes of pearls did not stir with her breathing, that no kind of youth or beauty could make a woman's skin so silvery pale as hers, or her eyes so huge and luminous. She had brought her sewing basket with her, as always, and her face was sweet and bright and innocent as ever. But at the sight of his defensive huddle in the corner, of the fear on his face he hadn't thought to conceal, she put down both occupation and disguise and licked her lips. Dear Frank! She laughed, still the little girlish giggle of before, while her smile stretched into an eerie sickle of delight. Are you afraid of me? Yes. Who's been telling you tales? A sweet voice and a pretty pout. but her eyes were full of the same smug and predatory amusement he had seen from the demon on the riverbank. It occurred to him that there had been a chance to keep playing along, to keep her acting the role of dutiful daughter, and that he had royally fumbled it. That didn't mean he had to take Mirela with him. Nobody. I was outside the room last night when you were all talking. I worked it out. I thought I smelled you there, she agreed. And it would have been a beautiful smile if there were not something subtly wrong with it, and it were not on the face of a dead girl dragged from her untimely grave by malice and the powers of hell. Oh well, this farce always had to end at some point. She drifted closer, quite gently, carefully, as if not to spook him. His back was already to the wall, and he could go no further that way, so he scrambled out of bed. He'd done no more than take off coat and shoes before turning in, and try to edge around her until he could make a dash for the door. Would you like to run, Frank? I prefer it when they run. Because you're wounded, I'll count to 10 if you like. That will be fair, wouldn't it? That will make it lots more fun. He wished he had quizzed Mirela more thoroughly about what exactly the Strigoi could do. Wondered if he faced only a girl's strength or something far greater. Instinct told him to run until his heart burst, but it would mean brushing past her, touching her. Even fleetingly, that was not something he wanted to do. I'm not interested in making this fun for you. He soothed his mind enough to reach out for the memory of sunshine. It was Frank's theory that Radu hoped he had the power to annihilate both the creatures with a gesture. That was why he had been moved to kiss Frank as soon as he had blinked the blinding dazzle out of his eyes. Time to test that theory. His hands tingled with the beginning of power. He could feel where sunlight still rested halfway across the world. Searching deeper inside himself, detached from this single moment, his thoughts went inward to the place where everything welled up, available to the mind, out of time. Starlight. It never truly went out. He closed his hands, began to pull it towards him. Alaya stepped closer, her angelic face creased with sharp suspicion. What are you doing? He felt something gentle touch the edges of his thoughts. Something grey, misty and slick. It flinched back as Alaya's mouth opened in shock. Her eyes widened to match, and then her expression slammed shut again, ugly as it had been when they argued. About Bucharest. Frank, that's cheating. He had time to feel smug. Just one moment of bright, uncomplicated triumph, clear as the light in his head. And then she stopped him. She reached out with her mind and closed it around his, as if she had closed iron manacles around his wrists. The greasy feeling of her mind tightened around his, as she pried her strong little mental fingers into his defences. His focus wavered. He scrabbled after it, and she got her tendrils into the gap and tore it to pieces. For a moment he was so little in control of his own body he couldn't remember how to breathe. She could have stopped his heart with a thought, could have made him feel anything she wanted him to feel. She chose to leave him breathless panic, the feeling that he had been walking all this time on a glass floor above the pit of hell. Now it had broken. He fell, and reason abandoned him. It didn't matter that running was what she wanted from him. Running was all he could think of. It didn't matter that, if she was anything like Constantine, she would keep pace effortlessly in a cloud of pale smoke. Nothing mattered. He had to get away. Alaya smiled, and leaned forward to kiss his forehead. Blood dripped in his eyes when she pulled away. The muscles of his legs screamed to run, but he couldn't, pinned through the chest by her will. Do you think if it was that easy to kill the Strigoi, it would not have already been done? Mirela's warning echoed in his head. He had ignored it unthinkingly, because obviously a natural-born Englishman would do better than any amount of foreigners. That went without saying. Shame joined his terror. As if that was exactly what she'd been waiting for, Elias stepped aside, gave him a clear path to the open door. The mental bonds fell from his limbs like rubber shattering under cold, and Frank took in a desperate gasp of air and bolted like prey. He tore out of the door, down the corridor, his new boots thudding against the floorboards with a thud as fast as his heart. His mind came back enough to jabber to him that he didn't know where to go. Out the entrance hall and then into the forest? He had barely escaped that last time. He caught himself on the corner of the main staircase. Not that way. Not out into the night. The girls had come and gone from the sitting room some other way. There must be a back entrance going down into the kitchen or the servants' quarters. Would Elia murder him in front of the servants? Surely they wouldn't stay here if they'd ever seen such a thing. He had almost bolted past the door to the sitting room, but now flung out a hand and caught the edge of the lintel, used it to spin him into the room, braced his back against the door and slammed it behind him. His wild eyes fell on a wide bar of iron propped up behind it, and he coughed a laugh, snatched it up and barred the door with sweat-cold hands. Ha! There was a laugh behind it, sweetly girlish, and then mist began to curl through the keyhole and seep through the cracks around the hinges and the underneath. "No," said Frank, and ripped away the curtain that concealed the other door. He bolted through. This, too, he tried to secure behind him, but it had no bar or lock, so he only shut it and ran out onto the landing. Narrow stairs, too cramped to go fast, and a larger flight to his right. He turned onto them, bolted down past symmetrical displays of weapons, stars of pistols and pikes. There must be a chapel somewhere, mustn't there? There would be a chapel in an ancient house in England, somewhere for the family to pray, when it was simply too much effort to go out of doors. There must be a chapel. He could hide under the altar. Mirela said they hunted by smell. He could smoke himself with incense and attar of roses and cower beneath the altar and hope. He threw open the next door. A gentleman's study, brown with smoke, lined with more books. A suit of armour on a stand in the corner. Bizarre helmet and a jacket with wings spreading from the back. Not that way. But there was a smaller door out of this room, and it opened as he hesitated. He had time to see a music room beyond, harpsichord and harp, some odd zither-like instrument flat on a table, a footman holding open the door, his many-coloured uniform inappropriately gay in this moment of terror. Frank had looked for no more than an instant, when a strength like that of a shire horse hauled him backwards, bent him like a bow. His spine curved, complaining, while his feet kicked out to stop himself being folded in half. Elia's small hand held tight and cold in his collar, her knuckles against the nape of his neck, and her pretty little face upside down to his, wide-eyed and disappointed. All of that healing, Frank, for such poor sport. I did not expect you to be caught so easily. She lowered her mouth as if to kiss him again on the forehead. There was no smell of breath from her, but this close the clay-cold reek of sodden soil was all but choking. He got one hand behind his own neck and batted at her grip, as ineffectually as if she was made of steel. With the other he tried to fend her mouth off, succeeded only in getting her two long fangs, close together in the front of her jaw like the incisors of rats, wedged in the heel of his hand. It was not a great pain, but it made him go cold. She leaned further forward, and the teeth drove through between his bones, came out the other side of his hand. She put out a long pink tongue, and lapped at the blood that pumped out. Frank shouted, "Ah!" more in disgust than in pain, just as behind him another voice shouted, "No!" And Radu Vacarescu hurled himself into his grandmother, like the captain of a village football team trying to wrestle his opponent to the ground. It should have been ridiculous. He was 3 times broader than her and almost twice the height. But she stopped him like a brick wall. Frank thought he even heard bones breaking. Elia took 1 step back, her teeth sliding out from Frank's palm. And in a curiously delicate version of Radu's own dismissive backhand, she slapped him across the face. The blow lifted Radu off his feet and flung him backward into a beautifully painted globe of the world that stood by the bookshelf. His spine met the polished wood with a splintering sound, and he sat in the wreckage just long enough, shaking his head as if to try and settle his brains, for Frank to be terrified she had broken him. For a flickering second it seemed Elia was worried too. She paused in her attack, waited until Radu began trying to struggle to his feet. Frank, pressing down on the puncture wounds, blood hot and slippery between his fingers, took the chance of her distraction to run to his host's side, as if he would be safe there. His instincts played him false. The position just made it easier for Elia to sweep up to them both, grab Frank by the throat, and push his head back with her other hand, bearing the great vein in his neck. He didn't think he was scared, didn't think he was in his right mind enough to have any true emotion, but he whimpered nevertheless, and kicked her hard in the legs, kneed her in the stomach. "No!" yelled Radu again, weaving on his feet a little, wincing as he forced himself to stand. "Let him go! He's mine!" He drew his sword, a long line of silver in the brown room, the blade whispering against the metal lip of the scabbard. He looked terrified, but his hand was steady. Yes, Frank thought, exulting in the fact that Elia could not simply force Radu to do what she wanted him to do. By the look of the malevolent concentration on her face, she was certainly trying. "Cut her head right off!" But Radu hesitated. He pulled his hand back for the blow and hesitated again. A mist coalesced behind him into the form of Constantine, who wrapped iron fingers around his descendant's wrist and stopped him like shackles. Hand in Frank's hair, Elia bent him all but double again, lifted him off the floor entire, his feet dangling. She raised him to her mouth. Radu cursed and punched Constantine in the mouth with the basket hilt of his sabre. The flesh split there but did not bleed, dry and white as bread dough, and Constantine slapped in return, turning the whole of one cheek red as a graze. Elia's lips were cold on Frank's neck, not like a kiss at all, but like a physician's cupping glass, narrow and tightly sealed. Frank's scatter of panicked emotions merged suddenly in one great wail of denial. He didn't want to die, not at all, but especially not like this. Teeth against his skin, rough-edged, dirty. He was scared to breathe, wanted to recoil, wanted even more not to move, so they came no closer. Constantine held up the hand he was not using to restrain Radu, gestured imperiously. "Halt." Elia obeyed. Frank still bent double in her hands and silently screaming. "My son, why should you have what you want, when you will not defer to us in one simple request?" Radu was trying to pry open Constantine's grip on his wrist, but the fingers would not bend, nor even loose their grip enough to allow the blood through to his purpling hand. He stopped at the end of this sentence and laughed bitterly. "Bribery, father." "Fairness," Constantine smiled. It was the same absurdly sweet smile Frank was used to in Elia, but seen upside down, with his neck aching fit to break, its sinister quality was far more evident. "It is but a little thing that we wish, to go to Bucharest. You do this little thing for us, and we allow you to keep your pet. Defy us again, and we have here the means to punish you in a way that will count. Shall he live or die, Radu? It is your choice." Thanks for listening. That was Sons of Devils, Chapter 5, read by Galadir. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers, used from Pixabay with thanks.